You've been hearing me talk a lot about Rob Arsenault and Weather My Trains. How about I tell you about my experience? I can sum it up with one word: easy. My first weathering job was a locomotive, and Rob made it simple. He sent me easy to follow shipping instructions, and in just a few minutes at the local post office, it was off. And the results? Absolutely amazing. As promised, Rob notched up the realism with an amazing weathering job, and it wasn't too long after that, my rolling stock was heading his way. And now you can make it even easier by ordering your next Bowser, Intermountain, Rapido, or Scale Trains locomotive from Weather My Trains. For more info, visit their website at weathermytrains.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining me from Rensselaer, Indiana, Kevin Norman. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ray. Appreciate you having me on.
Awesome to have you here. Boy, we've been chatting away, and, you know, we're meeting virtually, but we were maybe even in the same building at Amherst and somehow found a way to miss each other. I mean, I think it's kind of easy when you're in the mix of 26,000 people, but unfortunately I didn't get to go over and see you, but I know you were there and I know I was there. Tell me about your Amherst experience.
Yeah, ships passing in the night for sure. It was unbelievable. I had the opportunity to go to Amherst last year just as a guest, as an attendant or an attendee, and was absolutely blown away. Being here in Rensselaer, we have some good train shows around the Chicagoland area, but nothing to that scale of Amherst. And the amount of people was just incredible. My dad and I went out there. We drove out there. We actually drove out there in one day. We went to the show the very next day and then drove back. So in 3 days, we drove out, went to the show and came back, and we were absolutely drained. So we said, okay, next year we're going to go actually represent Notch 8 Customs, have a booth. We actually ended up having two. My dad ended up selling some stuff, but we went and did the show for both days and took our time getting there, took our time getting back in about 5 days. And it was just tremendous. The amount of people that I met, just legends of the industry and the hobby, people that you would never expect to meet or shake hands with, were coming up to the booth, or I was going up to them and they knew who I was, which was really kind of cool. I didn't think I had really any major name recognition, but I was pleasantly surprised. We picked up quite a few new customers, and I've been working through that backlog ever since, but absolutely incredible, and will probably be something that I do every year from here on out.
Yeah, Amherst is quite an experience. Those that haven't been there will sometimes say, it's just another train show. But I think you got to come experience it and then tell us if it's another train show or not. It's just the size of it, the attendance of it, the timing of it. It's like, I know people have argued with me that model railroad season's all year round, but I think, you know, the winter time is really kind of where we all kind of get in the house and get to the layout and, you know, really hunker down and knock some projects out while we don't have to mow lawns and do all that kind of stuff. And the timing's perfect. I mean, it just kind of kicks off right in the season, and just a multitude of different elements that make that show really special.
You bet. And it was a great way to start off the year. You know, like you said, we're in the shop typically during the wintertime, and being there at Amherst, one thing I'll say, it's incredibly motivating, right? So I don't know if you've experienced this in your modeling career, but for me, sometimes I go through these slumps, right? Where it's like, man, I don't want to touch a train or really mess with it or build anything right now. And I'll go several weeks without ever going up into the shop. But going to other people's layouts, going to something like an RPM show or going to something like Amherst, it's so inspirational, and it kind of lights that spark again. Whereas maybe you were kind of going through that slump, so to speak, or you were kind of not interested. It kind of rekindles that fire and that desire to get back to modeling, because there's so much more than just industry stuff or things to buy. There's very, very custom, very unique things that people are building. And it's amazing to see just how creative people in this hobby are. It's really incredible.
Yeah, it definitely gets the flywheel turning again when you get to, events and other people's layouts. And yeah, Amherst can on its own get a flywheel that's stuck moving again. There's so much to see, so much diversity in the hobby. And you bring along that too, because there's just, again, so many amazing things that can be done. And I call them, kind of doors or gateways to the hobby. And one thing you've really focused in on is customization and DCC and LED installs on locomotives. And, that really fascinates me. So I'm really thrilled to have you here. We'll talk about what you're doing with your business, Notch 8 Customs. But I'm really curious, what started you in this hobby?
So that's a great question. I started in this hobby like many of us in the hobby, where it was a circle of track around our Christmas tree, right, as a kid. And through late grade school, early high school, college, I didn't really do a whole lot with it. It wasn't really cool to be messing around with trains at that time. I was focusing on academics and collegiate beverages at the time. But that being said, after college, I kind of picked the hobby back up when I lived in Texas. There was a railroad, a short line there in Texas that kind of inspired me. And it was called the Lubbock and West Texas, or some version of that. It's now a Watco company is what it is, but little short line using SD90 Max as their switching power. And it was just really cool to see these old behemoths lumbering down light rail, going and switching a cottonseed press plant or a chemical plant. And that just really got me going. And so I started buying stuff, anything that I thought was cool. And I joke quite a bit with the friends that know me that there's this ascension, if you will, or levels of the model railroader. So when you start in the hobby, you start buying anything that you think is cool, right? You see something and you're just like, I have to have it. Even though I don't have a specific prototype or a specific area or locale nailed down, it's like, man, if that car is really cool or that locomotive is really cool, I'm going to buy it. And so I just started amassing all of this stuff. And as time went on, as I progressed in my career, I moved to Des Moines, Iowa, and I joined a local model railroad club there in Des Moines, the Raccoon Valley Model Railroad Club. Met some of my now best friends there. And through that process, there was a need there at the local model railroad club for somebody that understood DCC and the electronics. And I like to tinker. I'm curious. I like to take stuff apart, put it back together again. And usually there's a few screws left over afterwards. But so I was curious. And so I started to get into the DCC side of it because there was a need. And I figured, well, this is a good way for me to provide value to the club. There's tons of guys that know how to do scenery and track work. I didn't have any of that experience, but maybe I could provide value in this way. And so when I first started out, I bought a Conrail. It was an Athearn ready to run Conrail GP40, I want to say, or maybe 40-2. And I bought my very first decoder. It was a Soundtrax decoder, and proceeded to immediately fry it. No clue what I was doing, immediately fried it, called Tsunami. They were very gracious. They sent me a new decoder, and I'm like, okay, this time I've really got it. I watched a couple YouTube videos. I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night. Like, we got this, okay? So then I proceed to blow it up again. So I went through 2 decoders, my very first install. And the reason I start with this story or share the story is you have to make some mistakes when you get started. Because now at this point in my Notch 8 career, I've done thousands of installs at this point. I had somebody ask me just yesterday how many I thought I did. And I'm like, honestly, I don't know how to ballpark it, to be honest with you. But I've done so many installs, and it went from doing installs at the club to, hey, can you get into painting? You know, there's a model that isn't readily available or needs this patch out or something like that to make it accurate. And so I started messing around with an airbrush. And then there was a need for brass work. We had a guy in our club that wasn't necessarily modeling HO scale, but had some ON3 locomotives that he wanted me to look at. So I started tinkering around with brass. And before you know it, after several years, I was like, wow, this could really become a business. I had gotten good at it. I'm not going to say I'm excellent by any means, but certainly at that point, like I was getting good. It was definitely a skill, and people were very happy with my performance, and they were giving me their hard-earned money for me to do something that I really enjoyed. And I'm like, there's a business here. And so fast forward about 7 years to where I'm at today. I do this professionally. It is a part-time job for now, but we'll see where that takes me in the future. I have a shop above the garage in my house, and that is where I do all of my work. So I do custom painting, I do weathering, I do DCC and sound installations, custom detailing, all the way to, brass repair, re-gearing, re-quartering, remotoring, because brass is finicky. But once it's running well, they run like a Swiss watch. So I mess with that and get them running correctly and running right, so that you're not absolutely frustrated with your very expensive purchase of a brass model, and then all the way to scratch building locomotives that aren't commercially available. So, for example, an SD9M, nobody makes that right now. So I buy the appropriate parts, chop the nose, put everything together, and you have, for example, an EJE and E SDM that was originally built by the DMIR. Nobody else makes it. And I'm able to make that, paint it, and weather it and bring that to a customer. So that's kind of a unique thing that I offer, and complete rundown of how I got into the hobby and kind of what I do. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. And so let's go back a little bit here. I'm kind of curious about the club, and it sounds familiar to me because when I joined a club, it was, I was green as can be. I mean, I knew a little bit about it, but not a whole lot. And I think you find your niche, right? You find what you really enjoy or what you're good at. And for me, it was kind of administrative. I was kind of helping the club do some kind of, some graphic design stuff and trying to help in that direction. I wasn't a wiring guy. I knew a little bit about DCC, but only enough to be dangerous with it. And, it was just one of those things. And it sounds like for you, the same thing. Get in there and you see all these folks. Did you get to explore outside of that as far as being able to learn some scenery stuff or anything that was related outside of DCC, or did you just kind of fall right into that niche?
Well, I definitely fell into that niche, but I did have the opportunity to work alongside some of the guys that were really good at laying track or scenery or realistic operations of a layout, right? That was not something that I was familiar with, going to a club where we're working with car cards and we've got certain blocks that we operate on, and, trains have to pass and meet. And so you have to take a siding, and working with the dispatcher. I had no experience of that prior. I just assumed it was, hey, we just run trains around in a circle and we watch them run, which, I mean, we all enjoy that, but there's more that can be done with a layout than just running it around in a circle, right? That's how you get into prototypical operations. And there's a certain level of enjoyment and challenging aspect to running a layout like that. And so that was brand new. And so I got the administrative side down as far as how a layout flows and how you lay your track work, why a siding or a spur is here and it's oriented in the way that it is. I got better at laying track, and even got to the point where I had a small ON3 layout where I hand laid my own track. So I got better at that. Learned a lot about scenery from one of my good friends, Griffin Wall. So there was a lot that I learned, but I would say where I really found my niche, or where I really shined, was in that DCC realm, and it just grew from there.
As you, before you start taking on customer stuff, were there any projects of your own that you were working on?
I had worked on a few of my own locomotives prior to taking on customers, but at the time, so I mentioned that custom railroad that or that short line in Lubbock, Texas, where I lived, that I bought a couple of SD90 Max. They were Kato CEFX SD90s, and I ended up installing DCC and sound in those. And I also had an affinity for the Southern Pacific. So I had collected a few things that I thought were really cool. So I started with a set of Athearn F7s, an ABA set. And I had I had actually pre-ordered an Intermountain cab forward, the AC-12 cab forward. And that came with sound, but I ended up completely redoing it. I put my own speaker in it and upgraded the Loc sound decoder that was in it. And so I kind of started there. In addition to that Conrail GP40 that I mentioned earlier. And then after I started running some of that stuff on the club layout, they were like, hey, that sounds really good. What did you do to that? That's obviously not a factory equipped sound equipped locomotive. And so in talking to the guys there at the club, they started, just casually bringing me projects. Hey, do you think you could put sound in this? And they would buy a decoder, or they would buy the components, and I would just do the work. So it was just like, it was a snowball, right? It just, as it started rolling, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it got to the point where I was doing installs for more than just friends. I was doing it for other people in the hobby that I knew. And that's when I was kind of like, there's a business to be made here. And it helped me afford the hobby so that I could pursue my own interest. But the neat thing about what I do is because my interests are so varied, I'm able to work on locomotives, work on rolling stock that normally one person would never see come through their shop. So I get to see all kinds of really cool, really unique locomotives and rolling stock that otherwise I would just maybe see at a train show, but I actually get to work on them, which is really a privilege. I mean, people are entrusting me with very, very expensive models that, a lot of people have personal attachment to. So I take that very, very seriously. And while I don't take myself very seriously, I certainly take the job pretty seriously. And it's really been a lot of fun. Just it's kind of crazy to me that it's gotten to the point where it's at, but it's also really exciting. I think, going forward, if I can continue to, build the business, I mean, I think there's a real opportunity for this to be not just a major source of income, but actually Notch 8 really become a little more recognized, not so much as a household name like, say, Athearn or Intermountain, but I would like for Notch 8 to become synonymous with high quality work, whether it's DCC or sound, painting, weathering, custom building, scratch building, kit bashing, whatever it is. I would like that for Notch 8 Customs.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell your passion for it. You really enjoy getting these projects. And I've learned about you through Matt Fricks, who Matt is kind of the king of farming out, and not in a bad way. Matt has done something. We've interviewed him here on the podcast. And one thing he's realized is that time is a commodity and he only has so much of it. And all these other things going on in his life and the family life, plus building this layout that he's building, there's just certain things that he's just not going to do. He sends weathering off to Rob Arsenault at Weather My Trains. And I know he's had you do installs for him. And, and I think that's a great place. Time is very thin for a lot of people, and finding, what they can do, what they want to do. And hey, if DCC installation is your thing, that's great. But for a lot of people, it's foreign, or even if they could do it, it's easier and allows them for more time to operate on their land. I'm sure you hear that quite a bit, right?
I do. So I'll say this, what I do isn't necessarily hard, right? You can learn the skill and you can learn to do this really, really well. I'm positive just about anyone can do what I do, because if I can do it, anyone can. And I really, truly believe that. However, I think the difference is, what are you passionate about? So I love Matthew's approach, and I've kind of adopted that for myself as well. His passion is accurately modeling the gateway as best as he possibly can. And that requires a ton of planning and a ton of time and administrative skill and research. And so what Matthew has done that's really unique, and I absolutely love, is he's collected a team that will help him accomplish that vision, whether it's, like you said, Rob Arsenault doing the weathering, or for myself doing the DCC installations and the sound, or I'm going to paint a bunch of these Rapido GP40s for Gateway as soon as they come out for him. I think I've got a dozen or more to do for him. So he knows where he wants to focus his time and what he's passionate about. And so he'll find people and collect these people and bring them around to the table and say, okay, I'm putting you in charge of this thing. And I wouldn't say it's farming out as much as it is delegation of responsibility. Matthew has the kind of personality where he can help you see his vision. And you're like, yeah, I really want to help with that. And I personally have no interest in the Gateway Western, but because he has a passion for it, that makes me excited about it, right? So I just like trains, right? And I think most of us can say, hey, we really like trains, but I think the difference is the passion. So figure out what you're good at, focus on that. And then the other things that you aren't good at, because time is so valuable, because it is truly our most valuable resource, find people that you can either learn from that do it really, really well, or find people that will help you with your vision and help you accomplish that. The idea of farming things out, like I said, I prefer to look at it as delegation of responsibility. You're trying to accomplish a goal. you know that you can't do it on your own, or if you are able to do it on your own, it's going to require a ton of time and resources. So bring a team of people around you, like Rob Arsenal, like myself, that can help you accomplish that vision.
Yeah, for sure. That's some great advice. And again, knowing your why and knowing, what time you have to do it. What are you passionate about? And what are some of the things that aren't your niche and you can allow somebody else to help you? And they say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a village to build a model railroad at times too.
It sure
that's
does.
exactly what it is. So
it sure does.
So you're talking about some of this stuff, about learning these skills and whatnot. I know when I started with DCC installations, it was Don Iris who was able to help me and guide me along the way. And for you, where were you getting this information? Was it all YouTube University, or did you have some other guidance along the way?
That's a really good question. So I had help along the way. There was a gentleman at the club that showed me the basics of it, and really, he and I had very differing opinions on a lot of things. However, when it came to being passionate about the electrical work, and he was a union electrician, so he knew what he was doing, even if it was on a very small scale. His day-to-day job was electric, and he knew what he was doing. And so I just kind of followed his lead when I was at the club, and he showed me the basics of doing it and saying, okay, these are the tools that you need to get started. But he was also good enough as a leader and as a teacher to let me fail on my own, right? Some of these things you just have to figure out. And I do my very best to help folks that reach out to me when they're trying to troubleshoot a locomotive. But there's a concept of failing forward that I think anyone that is in this hobby and is going to try to get into the modeling or the DCC or the sound, there's this process of failure and saying, okay, that didn't work, and then rebuilding and restarting and building that passion, that desire to really hone your skills, as opposed to, just constantly reaching out for advice or help me fix this problem. I think if you're going to learn, I think there's a process of being okay with failure. And that's where he was really good. He'd say, okay, go do this and bring it back to me and we'll see if it works and what didn't work, and kind of learn from that. And so, it's good to have somebody there holding your hand for sure, or giving you tips on how to get started. But a lot of this too was just trial and error and figuring out what was working and what wasn't working. And, I started off installing a variety of decoders. I'm kind of down to one supplier right now. I was developing relationships with companies in Taiwan and China that were manufacturing speakers and bringing them into the States. And so I'm working with several of those right now. I'm actually trying to get some custom enclosures made for Tang band speakers and be able to fit those in long hood diesel locomotives as opposed to steam locomotives, because they sound excellent. But a lot of this is just trial and error, figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And after a while, it's kind of the idea where you're no longer doing something until you fail. You do it so many times that you can't really fail, if that makes sense. Like it becomes repetitious or muscle memory. You get to the point where failure just isn't an option. And that's kind of when you know that you've got that skill pretty well honed at that point. And it takes years to get there. I'm not necessarily trying to pat myself on the back, but it does take a long time. It takes a lot of patience. You're going to have frustrations if you try to get into the DCC and the electronic side. It's going to make you want to pull your hair out, or what hair you have left out. And that wasn't necessarily a dig at you, Ray. I promise. I'm losing my hair too, but it takes a lot of patience. It takes lots of tools, incidentally. As you amass this knowledge, you figure out that there are certain tools or certain supplies that you need. And it just, like I said, it's a snowball. It just keeps rolling and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where you're like, wow, okay, this is actually a standalone business. It actually has become something more than just, hey, I kind of do this on the side and it's a hobby. It's more than that. It's a passion.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give you two sayings. One will cover the comment regarding my head, and that's called "grass doesn't grow on a busy street." And then,
Fair enough.
And then the one that keeps coming back to me is an old fire chief once told me education's expensive. And, those are the kinds of the steps you go through. You talked about smoking a couple decoders or, the things that you learn as you go. And, you got to pay tuition at times. And, sometimes those things are tuition. And as you learn, what did you find was more of the challenging part of, customizing or doing DCC installs? What were some of the challenges early on for you?
I think early on, the challenge was just the basic skill set required to do it and the supplies, right? So getting that snowball rolling and having the appropriate tools, having the supply, the wire, the solder, the flux, the decoders themselves, right? How do I cash flow that? Because I've got to buy 20 decoders and then not get paid until the job is done. Well, 20 decoders, you're well over, you're north of $1,000 out in that money. So how do you collect that money? You don't have the name recognition to be able to ask for that money up front. It's not a full-time job. So you kind of feel bad asking for that money up front, right? And then also, I would say the biggest thing, and this is something I still struggle with, and I think we all do, is time management, right? So I'm working a full-time job outside of Notch 8 Customs, and honestly, if Notch 8 keeps going the way that it has been, it can become a full-time job. And I'm a little afraid of that, right? Because from a time management perspective, like, as it turns out, there are other things that I enjoy doing that don't involve trains. So trying to balance that time is really important. And then also trying to figure out how to cash flow and run a business is a challenge. And fortunately, like I said, I run another business outside of Notch 8. That's my day job. And so I have familiarity with cash flow and how to run and operate a business there. So that's a good thing. But time management and then just amassing the materials that you need to be able to do the job. I'm at a point now where I've amassed enough material where if I need something, I'm ordering it well in advance because I know I'm low on stock or whatever else. And I've got so many between paint and primer and brushes and tools and you name it. My entire shop, the entire area above a 2-car garage is dedicated to nothing but Notch 8 Customs at this point in time. And so amassing that material, it was probably the biggest challenge for me when I started this.
You mentioned that you like to do other things as well outside of, run Notch 8 Customs and obviously a full-time job and the obligations that go along with that. I jokingly say that if you want to have your model railroad journey come to a complete stop, start a podcast. And, for me, it's a challenge to get downstairs. And as I'm up here spending more time and, you got a microphone in front of you, that's the cost of a locomotive. And you got a board that's in front of you. It's a cost of probably 2 locomotives. And, what ends up happening again is, hobbies within the hobby. How has that affected you? Have you still able to do any model railroading of your own, or is it seemingly doing model railroading for other people?
That's a really good question. I have been planning my layout for, ever since I moved in the house. So 5 years. And the tape that I laid 5 years ago on the floor of where the outline of the layout was going to go is right below my feet as we speak. So it has not progressed beyond the planning stages in 5 years. And I would say, I'll say this. Obviously, I want to build a layout. I really do. However, I've had so much fun focusing on working with other people. And one of the things I love most about this hobby is the people, truly, that the layout to me is almost secondary at this point. So you can't see it behind me, but I've got a test track that I built, and I've got a module that'll travel with me to the St. Louis RPM this year featuring the EJ&E. And while I would love to have a layout where I can run a train around in a circle, I'm perfectly content to just run on that test track or run on that module for now. Now, eventually, I would very much like to build my layout, and I could talk for an hour about what that's going to be, but I would love to build that layout. But it seems like the priority or the focus for me right now has been getting Notch 8 up off the ground and building those relationships so that it's a self-sustaining business model. We're constantly getting new customers and retaining our old customers and continuing to do business. And eventually I'll get to building a layout, but right now it's just not been the top priority for me. I'm having too much fun working on everybody else's stuff, and I get to see so many cool things roll through the shop that otherwise I would never be able to see or touch or work on. So I'm having way too much fun with that.
Well, you got my curiosity up, though. Give me a summary of what this layout's going to be.
Sure. So I modeled the Chicago and Eastern Illinois. It is it still exists in a sense. So it was taken over by the Missouri Pacific and then the Union Pacific. So I am modeling the Chicago and Eastern Illinois in the early 60s from Dearborn Station in Chicago, which Dearborn Station still stands. However, the tracks out of Dearborn do not. So from Dearborn Station, Chicago, through Yard Center in Dalton, Illinois, which if you're familiar with Chicago railroading, you're going to recognize the name Dalton. There's a very famous crossing there between several railroads. That's a very hot rail spot for people to go and rail fan. And then south through Yard Center down through like Watsika, and then down to Danville is kind of the end of where my railroad will be. And so it'll be a really good mix of, busy city, passenger station kind of feel around Dearborn, right? You've got freight houses on either side of the rails leading out. We're going to model the Santa Fe engine and coach facility that was just south of Dearborn as well. And then that'll go out into your more suburban scenes and then into the country of, northern Illinois. So corn and soybeans and cows and very picturesque kind of stuff, rolling gentle hills and lots of crops and farming. And then finally terminate, like I said, down in Danville is the plan. So, and they had a beautiful station in Danville that I would love to model. So that was kind of the point at which I wanted to stop modeling that part of it. So the line still exists today. It's operated by the Union Pacific. Like I said, I'm modeling the early 1960s. So at this point, railroading was starting to kind of decline. Passenger service was struggling along. And so in the 60s, you started seeing railroads go from this beautiful, streamlined, cleaned, multi-colored paint schemes down to a simplified single paint scheme. And you look at the pictures from the 60s and even into the 70s, railroading got really dirty, right? And so there's just a lot of grime and it was tough. It was hard work, and it reflected the hard work that the people put into it. But there were still glimpses of the glory days, right? So Dearborn, you had multiple railroads coming into Dearborn. You had CNEI, you had Wabash, you had Erie, Lackawanna, you had Monon, you had Santa Fe. So you'd see the Zephyr coming in, you'd see the Super Chief coming in and stuff like that. But there's this grittiness to it in the early 60s that really drew my attention in and really reflected the challenge and the struggle of a industry that was declining and fighting for its life truly with these trucking companies that they once served right at these terminals, these warehouses were now starting to take dollars out of the railroad's pocket. So they were really struggling to streamline and continue forward. So it's just an interesting time period that I don't think gets modeled very often. I think a lot of people obviously are drawn to the transition era, and who wouldn't be, right? You've got steam and early diesel locomotives right next to each other, and that's wonderful. And then you've got guys that are, modern or ultra modern and stuff like that. And I'm so glad I don't model that because I couldn't afford it. Goodness gracious. But love working on your guys' stuff, just not my jam. But the 60s and the 70s are largely a time to me that just don't get modeled. And so that was kind of my inspiration for modeling Dearborn in that era of struggle and challenge and just a unique time period that you don't see very often. So I'm very, very excited to get started, obviously, but right now, obviously, the focus has been Notch 8, so we'll see. I'm not going to put a timeline on it because I guarantee I won't make it.
Where the heck did you learn so much about this? I mean, you got a book of knowledge on this whole thing that you want to build. Where'd you learn about all of it?
Well, so I would say a couple of sources. So, right, I practice Google Foo very, very well. So Google is a wonderful tool, and so is Google Earth, and being able to see the topography and learning where everything was at. But more than that, I would say I learned the most from John Egan, who wrote the books on the EJ&E, is kind of a local historian that I grew up with. He used to run Park Lane Hobbies in Dalton, Illinois. Great guy, excellent modeler. Have nothing but respect for him. And he really taught me a lot of these things, or as I would have questions, he would help answer them. And so I amassed books and resources on the CNEI and on Dearborn. And sometimes you find stuff in places you wouldn't imagine, right? So, if you're modeling the CNEI, you're like, well, I'm going to go find every CNEI book I can find. What was more advantageous sometimes was finding books or materials that focus on other major railroads. So I have several Santa Fe books that focus on their operations in Dearborn, and I've learned more and seen more through those pictures than in a normal CNEI book. So you have to be creative as to how you amass this information. And so one of the other things that I've done is I've gone to Dearborn because it still stands. And so I went downtown, I drove my truck downtown, and which I live out in the country, so I drive a big Ford F-250, right? So imagine me driving around downtown Chicago in a Ford F-250 and parked, and I walked around Dearborn, and I started to talk to some of the people there that were, it's I don't know what you want to call it. It's like it's got shops and little kitschy things in it, little restaurant. And so I started talking to them and just asking them about how long they've been here and what they knew about Dearborn. And so you end up meeting people or finding people, or they put you in touch with people that know a little bit more about Dearborn and about that area. And I love Chicago railroading. It to me, I was so blessed growing up being so close to so many awesome railroading spots. I used to spend a lot of time in South Holland, and we had the Grand Trunk and Western going through South Holland. Now it's the Canadian National. We had the EJ&E when we moved to Dyer, Indiana. We had the EJ&E going right past our house, which is, you could argue that I'm also an EJ&E modeler because I have more EJ&E stuff than I do CNEI, but I love Chicago railroading. And so one of the things that I enjoy the most about this hobby, aside from the people, is the history behind it. And that history is quickly disappearing. So Dearborn still stands. The head house and the tower, the clock tower still stands, but the train sheds, all of the tracks, the Lifschultz freight house and all, the Wabash freight house and the CNEI freight house, those are all gone. It's all a park now. And then as you went further south out of Dearborn, you went across the 21st Street interlockings, which had, I think, 7 different diamonds in that one interlocking. Very little of that exists anymore. And it's kind of hard to trace out actually on Google Maps. So part of this isn't just modeling because I enjoy modeling. It's trying to preserve a piece of history, and not just the railroad's history, but Chicago's history. These railroads are what helped build Chicago and make it into what it is today. And, at least in my own mind, I feel like I'm preserving a little bit of that history.
I think that's one thing that's missed is the connection between model railroading and its ability to tell American history. Yeah. And I've talked to this to a point with the club that I formerly belonged to about the history of, the American Industrial Revolution and the mills that were in the area. And I said, boy, we could model this right and get with a historical society and then get them to come in and kind of endorse it a bit, you can use it as a teaching tool. Here's a model. This is what it used to look like, or it used to look roughly like this. And there's so much awesome history out there. And, the other thought I'm having as you're telling this is you seem to be like me, that you go into an area and maybe you see some tracks in the dirt and you just start kind of following them out. Like, where did this used to go? This went somewhere. It was feeding. What was it? And then start asking questions and figuring out where things used to be. And sometimes I think I was born 100 years too late, but then, I think I would miss my cell phone if I knew it actually existed. But it is wild. And I think there's a great link there again between model railroading and the ability to tell history and capture it and teach it and say, this is the way things used to be. And this is the reason why things are today. And these are the things that built it. The American Railroad did this. And I think that's very cool that you found so much interest in the history and are able to capture it now to a point where you've got a planned layout to tell that story.
You bet. You bet. Now, I will tell you this. I agree with you in your statement about being born 100 years too late, but I'll tell you what, I really like air conditioning. I'm just going to go ahead and throw that out there. So there's a lot of niceties that we have now that we wouldn't have had 100 years ago, but that appeal of working for the railroad or being part of that time, I think we romanticize it a little bit, but at the same time, there were certainly aspects of that time. Everybody looks back to the 40s and 50s, the golden age of railroading. That's very idealized in our minds, but there's a reason why it was, right? It was pretty good. It was amazing to be a part of that time. And if we don't preserve that history before too long, that history is going to be rewritten, or those folks that were actually there, guys that actually worked on the railroad and saw that stuff come and go, they're going to be gone. So I would say for me, if I ever have an opportunity to talk to one of these old heads, one of these guys that's worked on the railroad, I want to spend my time doing that, because even if it's not something I'm particularly interested in, they gave their entire lives and their career to that. And that's really cool. And that's worth listening to. It's worth you taking a little time out of your day to hear about what they spent their life's work doing.
I think you make a very valid point. The history of the 2020s, the 2030s, the 2040s will be very easily captured. It'll all be captured in the data that we collect and the social media that we have and everything else. But that's history of the 30s, 40s, and 50s of the 1900s will be something we need to get down and make sure that we have in hand and make sure that that's passed forward, because there's a lot of lessons out of 100 years ago that need to be brought forward.
Absolutely.
So getting back to Notch 8 Customs and the stuff that you do there, and one of the things about being in the modern times and not back in the past is the amazing amount of things that are being manufactured today, including locomotives from our big manufacturers, and they're still, they're coming through with some amazing stuff, but yet there still seems to be a need for custom. Talk a little bit about the things that you're doing even on, the more modern stuff that's coming out.
Absolutely. So we are so blessed, honestly, to have the variety of manufacturers and locomotives and rolling stock that we do with multiple runs and different road numbers and different paint schemes. We are so blessed because not that long ago, we were limited to Athearn blue box, rattle the box kits that you had one road number. And so you bought, if you needed a unit train of that coal car, you bought 10 or 20 of the same car and relettered it, or maybe didn't even reletter it. And that's kind of what you were stuck with. And so as the hobby has progressed and grown, and injection molding and pad printing and decals have gotten so much better, if you look in the last 10 years of how many different new manufacturers have come to market with product, it's incredible. We're very blessed to have that. However, that being said, they're still a business, right? They obviously are passionate about what they do. I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of the industry greats and the industry giants, and it's wonderful talking to these guys, but they have their own interests and they have their own business that they need to run. And so they're not just saying, hey, we're going to produce this one really niche locomotive over here. They're looking at it from a perspective of, can I produce this model in a timely fashion with minimal cost and be able to market it and make a profit selling this locomotive? So when it comes to some of the more obscure or unique roads or details or locomotives, they're not as apt to pick those things up. Everybody wants to do an SD40-2 because goodness gracious, how many didn't EMD sell? Everybody I know has like 20 SD40-2s, right? So everybody wants to do those. Everybody wants to do a GP38-2. But when you start getting into, say, steam locomotives, every railroad had their own unique thing. And so in the past, it was only possible to get that kind of detail and accuracy out of brass. Now we're seeing folks like Broadway Limited, and we're seeing Scale Trains with their acquisition of the MTH tooling. They're going to be releasing, hopefully soon. I'm pushing for a GS4, just saying, just throwing that out there, but I'm not saying my opinion counts for much. They're going to be releasing stuff that we've never seen before in plastic, which is amazing, but there's still a need for custom building of models that these guys, these big manufacturers, probably won't produce just because they're not going to sell enough, right? So, for example, using my own modeling interest as an example, an SDM. So these were rebuilt by the Duluth Mesabi and Iron Range, and they were essentially chop nose SD9s with several modifications to the long hood, including getting rid of the 36-inch pan-top radiator fans, moving to the bigger fans, 2 bigger fans in the radiator section, along with battery boxes and sills and walkways, not unlike an SD24, as opposed to the low walkways and low battery boxes of a standard SD9. And there's a bunch of variations in between there. There's actually 4 phases of an SD9, and then you get into phases of SDMs, and they all have their specific details per the actual locomotive because they were all rebuilt by the DMIR. The likelihood of a major manufacturer manufacturing a locomotive like that, where there were less than 100 ever produced and have limited appeal to individuals in the hobby, I don't know too many guys that model DMIR or EG&E, but the guys that do want these so bad, and I'm one of them. So I finally was like, I'm just gonna build one. And I didn't really know what I was doing. In the first shell that I started working on, I mean, it was absolutely butchered, but it's gotten to the point now where I've made about 10 of these, and I have 10 more that I'd like to do for myself and for customers. And so in that instance, there's still a need for that custom scratch building for those locomotives. And then I'll also say this, the major manufacturers, sometimes stuff gets missed or it's not cost effective to produce a model in the absolute highest level of detail. And that's why we have ready to run models. We have Genesis or rivet counter level models, and there's variation, right? It's your 87 octane all the way up to 93 octane, type situation where there's different levels of that. So not everybody knows or wants to learn how to super detail a model, or don't have the parts or the wherewithal to get said parts. That's kind of where I fill that gap too. So even if it isn't just completely scratch building a locomotive or just putting sound and DCC in it, there's a added value there of adding the detail that you would like to see out of a model that you can't get in a rivet counter or Genesis level locomotive. So a good example of that would be the CF7s. Rail Power Products originally created the shell. I believe Athearn bought the tooling. It comes in a ready to run box right now. There's a lot of guys that would love to see that in a Genesis level detail. I kind of fill that gap until that is something that comes to fruition. If it ever comes to fruition, is super detailing those locomotives and making them look as if they would appear in real life. So there's a variety of things that I can and can't do. It all takes time and money, but there's still a need for that custom building, that scratch building, in addition to DCC or lighting or sound. And that's something that I've, as of late, I would say over the last year or so, really gotten a lot more work. Aside from DCC and sound installations, are these custom building projects. So I've got, I'm sitting here looking at, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got 6 locomotives that are primered that are all going to be, that were custom built to some extent, right? I either added details or made variations and changes to them. All 6 of these are going to be custom painted. They're not commercially available. The details that I've added to them or the modifications that I made are not commercially available. And it's anywhere from an Atlas RS1 that is going to be lettered up for a Cargill plant on Matthew Frey's layout. I've got an SDM. I've got an SD9. I've got a U30B that's going to be the Iowa Railroad, like banana boat yellow U30B. Precursor. So that I think the Iowa Railroad took over the old Rock Island line, if I remember right, after they went bankrupt. So it was like the precursor to Iowa Interstate. So they had a bunch of these bright yellow, super ugly, but also really cool U30Bs that were bright yellow. And so I'm building one of those and painting one of those for a customer, and a handful of other things. I got a GP15 that I'm working on that served up at the steel mills and was painted for ArcelorMittal. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. They took over parts of U.S. Steel or bought out certain parts of U.S. Steel. So that aspect of creating something unique that's not commercially available, that's what's really fun to me. Making something that you can't just pull off the shelf or go to a show and find, making these one of a kind, very unique models is really just a lot of fun for me. And it allows me to scratch that itch of seeing all of these other roads and other areas that normally I wouldn't see or model, but I get to see and actually work on these models and then send them back to a customer and see them on their layout. So that's been really fun.
I bet you it is. And be able to see your hard work go to someone and their reaction to it. And they're getting that specific model that they're looking for, that they've been searching for forever. And now they have it. Tell me about the process, because if I was to pick a locomotive and say, okay, I want you to paint this, it's never been produced before. What are you looking for from the customer? And then what kind of research on your side are you doing to figure all this stuff out, all these nuances that make this locomotive so special, so custom?
So that's a really great question. I would say it depends a lot on the project that I'm working on, but to give you an example, it starts with the customer coming to me and saying, hey, I have this idea. Just like you said, Ray, I'm going to bring this locomotive or this idea to you. And sometimes the customer has a locomotive that they're working on. Sometimes they don't. And they're just like, hey, I have this idea. And so we kind of spend some time doing what I would call ideation, right? So, okay, this is the base model. Can you find this base model? Do you want me to try and source this base model? Then it moves on from that to, here's the parts that I think we're going to need. Are decals commercially available, or are we going to have to make them ourselves? And then we would outsource or find somebody to make those decals. And fortunately, we're very blessed, by the way, with all the custom decal manufacturers we've got out there. I've worked with several of them, and it's just incredible, the flexibility that we have to do some of this stuff. So shout out to those guys, but big fan of having those custom decals being made and being made available commercially. It's just wonderful. So provided we have the decals, then I start putting together an idea of quoting time and material and what it's going to cost to actually build this locomotive. And more often than not, I would say so say I'm working on a steam locomotive. If it's all black, right? And that's all I have to do is paint the thing black. It's going to be a lot less expensive than if I have to paint it black, but then the boiler front needs to be graphite, and then the roof of the cab and the tender top need to be oxide red, and then it's got a silver painted whatever side rods, or you name it. Stuff like that starts to add costs. And so I try to take all of that into consideration, and I try to ask the customer, hey, what research have you done? Can you provide me any historical photos of what look you're going for? And then I can kind of give them options on what they want to do and how closely they want to replicate that locomotive. And I would say the sky is the limit, right? So it all just takes time and money. And more often than not, I try to be upfront with the customer. Hey, this is what I thought I could do it for. It's taking a little bit longer. Are you okay with me doing this? Or this is an area where we're not going to be able to accomplish what we were looking to do. Is it okay if we don't model this? And we kind of have to go through that process hand in hand. So I would say this, it's a very consultative process, building a custom locomotive or doing custom installs and DCC and sound and lights and stuff like that. And I try to work with the customer as much as possible. I try really hard to make sure that when somebody sends me their hard-earned dollars in the form of a locomotive or a rail car, it's not just disappearing into a black hole for the next 3 months before you see it again. And then it's like, oh, by the way, here's your stuff. Go ahead and pay me. We definitely want to make sure that they're ready for that, because sometimes, these projects can be fairly expensive. And so not everybody has the wherewithal to drop that kind of coin at a moment's notice. So you got to kind of prepare them for that. So it's a very consultative process. I try to work with the customer and I try to update them as much as possible. I would say it does kind of limit how quickly the process could be done. It'd be great if those locomotives could just disappear into the black hole and I could just do nothing but focus very, very intensely on the thing and do it the way that I would want to do it. But that's not the important part. The important part is that the customer is in the loop and the customer is happy with the finished product. So it takes a little more time, but it works the way that it should and the customer is happy. And that's the most important part.
I wouldn't ask you to tell me who your favorite customer is, because either we would make hurt Matt Fricks's feelings or we would make his head so big it wouldn't fit through the door. But tell me about your favorite projects. Do you have anything that comes to mind like, wow, I was really excited and it was just a lot of fun to work on a particular project? Does anything come to mind when I ask that?
Yes, my favorite project to date was also my most challenging. So you'll have to go to my Facebook page to see the video, but I did a Sperry rail car, and it had lights, it had sound, it had DCC, it even had changing colored LEDs underneath it as it was going along the rails and would change colors to detect, different defects in the rails. So it would change from green to red to white. It had ditch lights, it had a beacon, it had custom sound files, and like you're working in a very small space if you've seen those Walthers Sperry cars, and there's windows all over this thing. So you have to be very, very creative about where you hide it, because otherwise your spaghetti bowl of wires is going to be out there in the open for everyone to see. And so it took a very, very long time to complete. It was very challenging to do, but the final product was awesome. And I would say that's probably one of the coolest projects that I've done to date. The next one would be I installed sound and DCC and lights into a Walthers crane. So they're American, Ohio. I forget if it's a 25-ton crane or what it is, but I did one of those for a friend of mine who models the CNW, and even drilled out the plastic spotlights that are on the top of it, found the tiniest little speaker I could find that still made noise, and put a tiny little ESU Loc sound decoder in there. And it had all the noises, the winch going up and down and rotation, and even had the sound of a small diesel engine because it was self-propelled. And that was really just a lot of fun. My only regret there is I couldn't animate it. So I didn't have the capacity to put motors in it so it automatically raised and lowered and turned around, right? But then we're getting into Lionel 3-rail toy trainer type area. And so I'd like to stay away from that. But it would have been cool. I'm not going to lie. But I would say those are probably two of my more favorite projects to date. But I would say for some of the, I don't want to call it common, but I love seeing really unique brass locomotives, steam locomotives come through the shop, because there's just so much variety. I think back to a Hallmark Santa Fe Blue Goose that I did not that long ago. Very rare model, very few ever imported. And I actually got to not only see it, but run it, work on it, take it all apart, and put it all back together again. And there were no extra screws left over, which is a very positive thing, but put sound and DCC and LEDs in that. And I had to be very, very careful. A lot of this takes very, very close attention to detail, because you're drilling into these locomotives in some cases to be able to run your wiring to fit an LED. And the opportunity for something to go wrong and for you to horrifically damage this locomotive is tremendous. And in a lot of cases, not only are they expensive, they're somewhat irreplaceable, right? So you have to be very, very careful. But I like that challenge. So yeah, I would say those are probably the ones that come to mind just off the top of my head of what I really, really enjoy seeing coming through the shop.
If I were to go to a hobby shop now and buy a locomotive off the shelf, even though, let's just say it was a top end manufacturer, and even we'll call it a modern diesel, what are some of the opportunities in custom to make that go from like a good locomotive to a great locomotive? If I were to send it to you, what are some of the things that I would want to do to it?
You bet. So if you were to buy something off the shelf, depending on what it did or didn't have on it, things that I immediately like to add are going to be all of the end details. So your MU hoses and your air hoses, any of your MU receptacles or stands or anything like that. Ditch lights are a big one. Man, I get comments or requests all the time to just do ditch lights. And I don't know why they're such a pain, but they are. And I'll be honest, I do a lot of them. They're not my favorite thing to do, but man, it really just makes it makes all the difference in the model's appearance. From there, if you're modeling more modern locomotives, a lot of locomotives on the nose are going to have different air vents or even a big plate of sheet steel cut in the top so that you can easily access the toilet and the nose. And that was kind of an afterthought or something that was added aftermarket that doesn't get modeled often. Windshield wipers, man, that's a big one. I think that really just sets a locomotive apart. And while we're kind of focusing on the nose of the locomotive, make sure your handrails are painted, right? So a lot of times they're cast in a single color, but the ends of the railings are painted yellow or white, or the ends of the steps going up to the locomotive are painted yellow or white. A lot of your door hinges on the doors of the locomotive are silver or so worn down from a repetitive use that if you just with a little brush and a little bit of silver paint those, it's just those itty bitty little details that really just set a model apart from being a off-the-shelf model. Hey, I just pulled it out of the box, cut the trip pins off of it and threw it on the layout and started running it, to really modeling something unique and making it look different. I would say things like undersill details, so your traction motor cables and things of that nature, your Salem air filters. I would say one of my favorite things to do on diesel locomotives is add the ground lights directly underneath the cab, something that is starting to get modeled and produced from manufacturers' perspective nowadays. But in the past, that was never something that was ever modeled. And it takes 2 LEDs, a little bit of super glue, and a drill bit, and you've got ground lights. And I just think the effect is just really, really cool. Another thing that I like to add, if it doesn't already have like see-through or etched walkways, I like to add those. There's a lot of really good manufacturers out there that provide the tread pattern for the walkways or for the steps on the stairs that are either etched brass or whatnot, and add those details in. And it really just adds a level of realism to the model, just like you would see and experience in the real thing. So making sure it's got the appropriate horn. It seems like a lot of manufacturers all get the same horn and throw it on every single locomotive with every run. And it's like, that's not what they really had. In between CalScale and Detail Associates, Details West, Athearn makes a variety of horns and all brass castings. Tremendous variety, tremendous opportunity to get the right horn on that locomotive. So those are just a few things that I would start looking at. And then you can even go as far as doing a detailed interior and lighting that interior and painting that interior with all the warning labels on the electrical cabinets. I mean, you could go way, way, way down this rabbit hole if you really wanted to. It just comes down to what the customer wants. And I'm willing to go down that rabbit hole with you if that's what you want to do. As far as you want to go, that's what we'll try to accomplish.
If you're one that's listening right now that wants to dive down a rabbit hole, where would that person go to get a hold of Kevin at Notch 8 Customs?
Yeah, so you would go to my Facebook site. Just type in Notch 8 Customs. I am working on a website and will be launching a YouTube channel here in the near future. But for now, reach out to me on Facebook. Like I said, Notch 8 Customs. Hit me up, send me a private message. I try to respond as quickly as possible, and we can get the train rolling, so to speak. I'd love to work with you guys, and I really like the unique. So don't think that your project is too big, but also don't think your project is too small. I'm happy to help where I can and offer my services to anyone that wants to work with me.
Well, that's awesome, Kevin. I really appreciate you stopping by tonight on Around the Layout, and we'll share all of those links in our show notes as well. So you'll be able to click on that and go right to Notch 8 Customs Facebook page. And we'll even hint tonight, and we're just going to leave it as a hint. You and I are working on a fun project that I think it's going to be really neat and an opportunity for us to share around a project related to the podcast. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you get done with that project, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that comes out. So Kevin, again, thank you for coming on Around the Layout and sharing your model railroading story.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Ray, and have a great evening.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.